What's up, y'all? It's GC Kinsey, here to discuss the framework of assigned gender at birth and how we can talk about it responsibly. If you've spent any time in trans and non-binary circles, there's a good chance you've heard the phrase assigned gender at birth. This refers to what happens when a baby is born and the doctor looks at their anatomy and says, it's a boy or it's a girl. That doctor is assigning the baby a gender based on their sex. So why do we frame it this way? Why do we say the baby was assigned that gender rather than just they were born as that gender? Here are a few reasons. First, babies don't have a concept of gender yet. That doesn't happen until they're a little further along in their development. Most people have a sense of gender identity by around age 3 to 5, though of course some of us don't know how to understand or articulate what our true genders are until we're much older. I was almost 30 before I fully understood mine. Second, sex doesn't always match up with gender. So when the doctor says it's a boy or it's a girl, they're really just giving it their most educated guess based on the anatomy they see. In the majority of cases, that guess ends up being right, and that baby grows up to be cisgender. But in some cases, that guess ends up being wrong, and the baby grows up to be transgender. Third, neither sex nor gender are binary, but this practice of assigning genders to babies very much is. Because notice how babies are assigned either male or female at birth, even though we know some babies' anatomy doesn't fit into either of those categories. But instead of just being acknowledged as intersex, they're put into one of those binary gender categories anyway, oftentimes forcibly with non-consensual surgeries. And that brings me to the final reason why we use this framework, which is that there is a very coercive aspect to the way we deal with gender in society. And pointing out that genders are assigned helps call attention to that. Assigned gender goes far beyond just a marker on a birth certificate. It kickstarts all the social roles and expectations and other baggage around gender that's placed onto us before we even develop a sense of self. The practice of assigning gender at birth is deeply intertwined with upholding a cis-centric binary system as the default. And we can clearly see that from the way intersex people are forced into medical treatment they don't need and never asked for, and trans people are gatekept from medical treatment they do need and have to beg for. So in that sense, I think it's a good thing that we now have this framework for talking about assigned gender. I also think it's a good thing because it's a more accurate and respectful way to address trans and non-binary people's pasts. I remember a time when we used to say things like, a trans woman is someone who was born a boy but later realized she was a girl, or even later became a girl. But trans people aren't changing our genders, we're affirming our genders. So instead of saying something like, this trans man was born as a girl, or he used to be a woman but now he's a man, we can more accurately convey his trans experience by saying he was assigned female at birth and then transitioned to affirm his true gender as a man. That distinction is crucial because it gives trans people a way to avoid misgendering our past selves or describing ourselves as someone we never used to be. So with this framework, we get the acronyms AFAB, assigned female at birth, and AMAB, assigned male at birth. And as I just explained, the intention of developing this language and terminology was a good one. But over time, something not so good has happened with these terms. They've been frequently misused to the point where a lot of times they end up doing more harm than good. This can range from well-intentioned but inaccurate attempts at making language more inclusive, all the way to misgendering trans people with extra steps, under the guise of, I'm not being disrespectful, I'm using the politically correct terms. So now I want to share 3 examples of ways that AMAB and AFAB get misused in ways that cause harm. Number 1. Asking non-binary people whether they were AMAB or AFAB. People often bring this up in an innocuous way, like something they're asking just to get to know you better, the same way they might ask where you grew up or what you do for a living. But when you actually think about it, were you AMAB or AFAB is a pretty invasive and disrespectful question. At best, it's like saying, yeah, cool, you're non-binary or whatever, but what gender are you really? And at worst, it's like saying, hey, what's in your pants? What people are getting at with this question under the surface is how they should categorize you in their heads. Whether they should think of you as a boy NB or a girl NB. Because apparently existing outside of that binary entirely isn't good enough. This is not an unexpected result of growing up in such an overwhelmingly binary system, right? It is so ingrained within us, NBs included, to categorize everyone we meet as either a man or a woman that most of us just do it without thinking. And it takes a lot of work to break free from that. Many people who haven't done that work think it's impossible to fully understand a non-binary person without knowing what their assigned gender at birth was. Like, I had one instance where I mentioned a non-binary friend in conversation, and the person I was talking to said, "I'm sorry, I just can't picture what kind of person you're talking about when you say they. Is this an AMAB or an AFAB NB?" And I know several people whose family and friends wouldn't stop pestering them about the assigned genders of their non-binary partners. The problem with this is that once someone finds out what gender a non-binary person was assigned at birth, they usually start treating them as that gender or misgendering them more often, whether they mean to or not. And that is a deeply painful and horrible thing to experience. So knowing that could happen, can you really blame any non-binary person for keeping their assigned gender to themselves? Number 2, replacing men with AMAB and women with AFAB. I see this one happen a lot in attempts at more inclusive language. For example, I'm a cosplayer, and every time hotel rooms open up for a convention, I see posts like "looking for roommates, AFAB only," or AFAB preferred. And what those posts most likely mean is that the person would have originally said women only or women preferred, but they've since become aware that non-binary people exist and wanted to include us too. But what that person doesn't realize is that they might end up getting responses from men who they don't want to room with who happen to have been assigned female at birth. Or they've inadvertently excluded some women or NBs who might have made great roommates, but they happen to have been assigned male at birth. Another example. Let's say an organization realizes that the way they've been talking about men and women in their literature is cis-centric. Like in healthcare, men's health and women's health is historically based on cis men and women. So to make their materials more up-to-date and inclusive, a doctor's office or hospital might think, well, all I have to do is replace all references to men with AMAB and all references to women with AFAB, and boom, problem solved. And seriously, props for trying. But unfortunately, that doesn't solve any problems. It actually creates more. Because your assigned gender at birth is about your past. It says nothing about who you are today. And I'll use myself as an example of what I mean by that. My AFAB body currently has testosterone as its dominant hormone, and will one day have no reproductive organs, and maybe or maybe not tits. The jury is still out on that one. That is a wildly different body than someone else who was also assigned female at birth but is a cis woman and is estrogen dominant and has all of her original reproductive equipment. And also wildly different from other trans people who were assigned female at birth but transitioned in very different ways than I am. And also wildly different from some intersex people who are AFAB. You see where I'm going with this? AMAB and AFAB may sound like more inclusive terms, but in most contexts, they're just as non-specific and frankly useless as men and women. And as you can see from both the roommate example and the healthcare example, AMAB and AFAB are not adequate replacements for men and women. Because just like there's no one universal way to be a man or a woman, there's also no one universal way to have been AMAB or AFAB. And that leads me to the third way these terms get misused. Number 3, making blanket assumptions based on assigned gender at birth. A lot of people think there's some magical thing that unites everyone who is assigned the same gender at birth, other than the original gender marker on our birth certificates. But as I just demonstrated in my previous point, there's not. There's no one way that all AMAB bodies look or all AFAB bodies function. There's no one way that all AFAB people were raised or all AMAB people were socialized. But this assumption is used all the time as the basis for blanket statements about trans and non-binary people that really make no sense. For example, I've seen people assume, very much incorrectly, that there's no way trans men or trans masculine NBs can perpetuate toxic masculinity because of their AFAB socialization. I've even seen some trans men and trans masc NBs make that argument about themselves to excuse their toxic masculine behavior. And I can tell you personally, as a trans masc NB, that toxic masculinity is something we all have to fight, regardless of gender. We all live in a culture that's steeped in it, and just because you were AFAB doesn't make you immune to it. Even worse, these kinds of blanket assumptions are used to fuel and legitimize attacks on trans rights. One example where I see this a lot is in debates around whether trans women deserve access to women's spaces, and of course they do, they're women. But I've heard some cis women make arguments like, trans women have AMAB bodies, so it gives them an unfair advantage if I have to compete against them in women's sports. Which ignores the fact that a trans woman's AMAB body could be shorter, or smaller, or less muscular, or have less testosterone in it than the bodies of her cis female teammates and competitors, and not give her any advantage at all. Plus, advantages vary based on the sport in question. I don't want to see AMAB anatomy in the women's locker room, which ignores the fact that a trans woman's AMAB anatomy could have been medically altered to the point where, even naked, you would never know she wasn't cis. Trans women were AMAB, so they were raised as men and don't understand the experience of being a woman, so they don't belong in women's support groups. Which ignores the fact that a trans woman could have started transitioning so young that no one ever did raise her as a man. Or she could have transitioned later in life, but she was still always socialized and treated differently than the men around her, even when she was still being mistaken for one of them. But regardless of any of that, she does still understand the experience of womanhood because she is a woman. These kinds of blanket assumptions are rooted in bioessentialism, the belief that it's sex, not gender, that's most important in how people engage with each other socially, and that sex is universally binary and immutable. And what I don't think a lot of people who use bioessentialism to prop up their transphobia realize is that it harms cis people too. The assumption that all AMABs are alike and all AFABs are alike leads to deeper scrutiny of everyone's bodies, cis people's included, and stricter efforts to correct bodies that don't fit the norm. And like, what even is a normal body? But by using the language of AMAB and AFAB to fuel these bioessentialist arguments, language that trans, non-binary, and intersex communities created to use for ourselves, transphobic people know they can make their arguments seem more legitimate. And that leads to many trans, non-binary, and intersex people shying away from using AMAB and AFAB because of how those terms are now being weaponized against us. So does all of this mean it's time to stop using AMAB and AFAB entirely? I actually don't think so. There are some situations where those terms are useful, so I think getting rid of them would be like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Besides, what's the alternative? Going back to saying trans people were born a man or born a woman instead, over my dead body? No, I think the much better approach is to make sure we're using the terms AMAB and AFAB responsibly. So what does that look like? Here are 3 tips. Number 1, remember that assigned gender refers to the past, not the present. It's just a thing that happened on the day someone was born. That's it. So a very simple way to start talking about assigned gender more responsibly is to say someone was AMAB or AFAB rather than someone is AMAB or AFAB. That frames it correctly as part of their past instead of any kind of significant characteristic of their present. And I think this is something that's just as important for trans people to consider when talking about ourselves as it is for cis people to consider when talking about us. I hear a lot of trans people say, I'm AMAB or I'm AFAB present tense, or describe their identity with their assigned gender. For example, I'm an AFAB NB. And make no mistake, you can describe yourself however you want. But I think it's important to take a step back when you're describing yourself in present tense according to one thing that happened in your past, and ask yourself, why? Why does that birth assignment matter to you? Why do you volunteer it to others? Why do you hold on to it as part of your identity? The answers to those kinds of questions might give you some perspective on whether you're talking about assigned gender in a responsible way. And I'll give you an example of how I worked through this for myself. When I would talk about how I do my makeup for drag, I used to say something like, I start with a masculine contour under my drag makeup because I have AFAB features and I'm trying to balance them out. And I will fully admit, you can probably find some examples of me saying this in some of my older makeup tutorials. But when I really thought about it, I went, wait a minute, what does AFAB features actually mean? Like, that is extremely non-specific. Because a cis woman and a trans man who's been on T for decades, and myself, a trans masc NB who's only been on T for less than a year, all have AFAB features. But those features are obviously going to look extremely different on each of us. Having features that others interpret as masculine or feminine isn't tied to your assigned gender, it's tied more to hormones and how they change your face. So that made me realize the better way to phrase this would be something like, I start with a masculine contour under my drag makeup because I was AFAB and I'm still waiting for the testosterone to kick in and masculinize my features. Or pre-T, I would have specified I wasn't on hormones yet. That simple shift in phrasing frames my assigned gender at birth in the past where it belongs, and doesn't erroneously connect it with certain gendered facial features. And I think that kind of thought exercise is worth going through if you're using your assigned gender at birth as a self-descriptor in the present tense. If you do still decide that you'd rather say, I am AMAB or I am AFAB, well, like I mentioned, how you describe yourself is up to you. But if you're describing someone else, that's when you should definitely only use AMAB or AFAB in the past tense, which brings me to my next tip. Number 2, recognize that someone else's assigned gender at birth is none of your business. Because someone's assigned gender is part of their past, and it's very personal information, it's up to them to decide when to disclose it, if they disclose it at all. It's okay to be curious about someone else's assigned gender, curiosity is natural. But that's still not a good enough reason why you need to know. Outside of certain medical settings and intimate partnerships, there's literally no situation where you will ever need to know someone else's assigned gender. If they volunteer that information, great, but there's no reason to ask about it, and in fact doing so is generally seen as rude. There can be a lot of dysphoria involved for a trans person if you find out what their assigned gender was, especially if they weren't the one to tell you. And there can also be major consequences like safety issues and discrimination if you disclose that information about someone else. That's why it's so critical to only talk about another person's assigned gender if you have their permission and if it's relevant. So when is it relevant? That brings me to my last tip. Number 3, if you have to discuss sex or gender-based information, be specific. This is probably the one that will take the most practice for those who have already picked up AFAB and AMAB terminology in an attempt at more inclusive language. And the key to getting it right is to remember what I said earlier about how there's no one universal AMAB or AFAB experience. In tip number 2, I mentioned that the only scenarios where you might need to know someone else's assigned gender at birth are certain medical settings and intimate partnerships. That's because in those situations, sex and gender-based information often is relevant, so I want to use those scenarios as examples for how to be specific when asking for that information. In a medical setting, information about a patient's gender will be relevant to how you address them, and information about their sex may be relevant to the treatment they need. But that doesn't necessarily mean you need to know their assigned gender at birth. That assignment tells you nothing about what body parts or hormone profile they have now. Sure, there are times when their assigned gender might come up by default, like if you're providing gender-affirming healthcare or reproductive healthcare. But in most situations, it's just not going to tell you anything useful. It's much better to ask for the exact information you need instead of trying to parse it out from someone's assigned gender at birth. So this might look something like asking, do you have a prostate? Because if so, we recommend screening for prostate cancer. Or do you have a uterus? Because if so, we recommend a pregnancy test before this procedure. Instead of just saying, you were AMAB, so you must need this exam, or you were AFAB, so you must need this test. Assumptions like that are unhelpful at best and harmful at worst. Being specific is much more effective. In intimate partnerships, information about someone's sex and gender may be relevant to whether you find them attractive or whether you would be compatible together. Some people might ask a potential partner who's trans, particularly if they're non-binary, were you AMAB or AFAB, to try to determine that compatibility, when what they really need to know is not that person's assigned gender, but instead what anatomy they have now and what they like to do with it in sexual situations. So here again, it's better to be specific, and in fact, if you start by volunteering what body parts you have and what you like to do with them, then a potential partner may be more likely to do the same without you even having to ask. It's also worth noting that, particularly in long-term committed partnerships, some people do think it's important to know about their partner's past history, and they might include assigned gender at birth under that. So that's obviously something to get on the same page about before disclosing that part of your history. I think a big reason why people find it hard to be specific in medical settings or intimate partnerships or otherwise is that there's a culture of shame around sex that makes it awkward to ask pointed questions about it. But I promise you, it is a lot less weird to just say, do you have XYZ body parts, whether it's for recommending medical treatment or determining sexual compatibility, than to try to connect someone's assigned gender with certain body parts and risk being way off the mark. I want to wrap up with one final thought about those 3 tips for using AMAB and AFAB responsibly, which is that it's not something you can memorize your way into. There's no possible way to keep a list of scenarios in your head where using AMAB and AFAB is appropriate and makes sense. It takes deeper critical thinking skills and practice over time. It takes making mistakes and learning from them and doing better. It takes adapting to new information and ever-changing context. Maybe someday in the future we'll have even better language and a better framework for talking about this. Maybe AMAB and AFAB will become relics of the past. But for right now, I think that even though they're not perfect, they're still the best terms we have for describing a specific aspect of our history. So I hope this video has given you some good information to process and some good tools for using AMAB and AFAB responsibly. And now is where I want to turn the conversation over to you. How do you feel about the language we have around assigned gender at birth? Do you use it or not? What are some ways you've seen it used responsibly versus misused or weaponized? What questions do you have about all this? Drop a comment below and let's get a discussion going. And I know this is a very loaded topic, so if y'all could keep that discussion respectful, that would be fantastic. You can also reach out to me on other social media. I am GC Kinsey across all platforms. And while you're here, feel free to check out some of my other videos. I have more vlogs like this one about my experiences as a queer person, along with cosplay music videos, makeup tutorials, pre- and post-testosterone voice recordings, and more right here on this channel. So make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss anything new. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all of your support. I hope you learned a lot of new things, and I will see you on the next one.